Good afternoon and welcome to Marketing Live for this final day of September 2016. I'm your host, Rob Zinkin. I serve as Associate Vice President for Marketing at Indiana University, and I'm very excited about today's topic. On a previous episode, we talked about the branding of a comprehensive fundraising campaign as a unique moment in the life of an institution. And another unique moment is when a new president takes the helm, and we have two great guests this afternoon to share their experiences managing and leveraging a leadership transition from a marketing standpoint. Higher Ed Live is produced by M. Stoner, a marketing and communications firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. And today's live viewing experience is powered by Maestro, the premier marketing tech platform for broadcasters. So let's meet today's guests. Jackie Ostrowicki is Assistant Vice President for University Affairs and Director of Marketing and Strategic Communications for the University of Nebraska's four-campus system. Nebraska, by the way, welcomed its seventh president, Hank Bounds, in April of 2015. Jackie joined the university in 2014, although she had been an adjunct instructor there for several years, and she brings a wealth of private sector experience. So Jackie, great to have you with us. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
And next, let's meet Nicole Yucht from the University of Florida. Nicole is Assistant Vice President of UF Communications. The University of Florida welcomed its 12th president, Kent Fox, in January of 2015. And like Jackie, Nicole joined her institution in 2014, and she has an extensive background in healthcare marketing and communication. So Nicole, great to have you with us as well.
Thank you.
So you both started at your institutions in 2014. You both welcomed new presidents in 2015. So I can't wait to hear all about this. Lots going on there. But before we get to the topic at hand, I would like to give listeners an opportunity to learn more about each of you. So let's start with something beyond your official bios. And I'm interested in hearing about your professional journeys. If you could share something, whether that's a specific experience, a mentor, or any other significant influence that has had a lasting impact on you in your career path. So Jackie, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks, Rob. Well, I would say if I look back through my career journey, it's been interesting. I actually started in the ad agency world as a copywriter producer, and so went through the ranks on that end, and then I ended up working in the private sector as the director of marketing for a 30-person internal ad agency at a company that services student loans. So it's a little bit of my background, and then came to the university. One thing I would say has really shaped me, I was with a company, Nelnet, that services student loans for 8 years, running that 30-person team. And 2 years before I left and came here, I wanted something new. I wanted to do something a little bit different. And they had a company that they had acquired that helped job seekers, and I asked if I could throw my hat in the ring to help with it. And 24 hours later, I was the president of a digitally driven product, in addition to continuing to run the marketing. And so the things I learned was running an actual P&L instead of just running a cost center, working with technology, and really running a small startup. And so I thought when I came to the university, there was no way that I would really use that startup experience, but with commercialization and tech transfer and the huge role that the university has in being an economic driver in the state, it has actually prepared me very well for my experiences here, in addition to my marketing experience.
Great, terrific. So Nicole, any noteworthy influence that has shaped your professional story?
Yes, well, as you mentioned, I spent the first 25 years or so of my career in healthcare, and when I started, marketing and advertising was really considered tacky and gauche and something maybe only lawyers did. And so obviously that mindset has changed in that industry. So 2 years ago when I started in higher education, I left the healthcare market only just because I really felt like I wanted to change and was ready for something different. So this opportunity here at the University of Florida opened, and so when I started in health or higher education, I noticed a similar sort of attitude about marketing and communications from faculty and administration, like I did 25 years ago. So in many ways it felt like home. But what I've noticed is a much more rapid adoption of the value of communications, more so than what I saw in healthcare, and that's been very positive and very, very fun. So looking forward to a lot more.
Excellent. Well, let's also set the context for each of your universities. So for example, Jackie, I know that your president was someone who was completely new to the state, completely new to the institution. So give us a little bit of background on the situation and perhaps some of the high-level opportunities and challenges with the new president coming in at Nebraska.
Sure. In order to do that, I need to talk a little bit about the president that preceded him. So the prior president, J.B. Milliken, had been at the university for 10 years before he left, which, as you know, is a pretty long time in presidencies. He then left to go to the City University of New York. So the background for the state and the university is they were used to having someone who had been there for a long time. They were very established as far as his personality, his management style, his vision. At the same time, the governor of the state had been the governor for 10 years. Both of those leaders turned over just about at the same time. So we had an interim president. They were doing the search, and the president that was selected, Dr. Hank Bounds, was new to the state. He had a new governor starting at the same time, and we also had about a third of the legislature turning over at that time due to term limits and seats and so forth. So there was a lot of change and flux going on in the state at the time that Dr. Bounds started. In addition to that, President Milliken was from the state of Nebraska, so he was a son of Nebraska. And there is just some inherent knowledge, I think, being part of a state and growing up in a state. So coming from the deep South, I grew up in the deep South, although I don't have an accent. I grew up in Alabama. Coming from the deep South to Nebraska can be quite a culturally very, very different. And so what we thought about was not only someone coming into the state, new, learning kind of the mannerisms of the state. A lot of times we have what we'll call Nebraska nice, or the Nebraska letdown, where people are just very, very polite, and you have to maybe manage around that. They're not as brusque as perhaps someone from the East Coast would be. So how do you take those things into accommodation and consideration? The other thing is he has two young children. At the time that he arrived, they were 11 and 14, and he and his wife, Susie, who is a former high school teacher, have lived in Mississippi their entire life. So thinking about the psychological accommodations for the family and also for himself and how they would fit in, because that obviously affects a president. How would we introduce him to a state? How would a Southerner be welcomed by the state of Nebraska? How do we introduce him to people across the entire state? We have two major urban areas, Lincoln, Omaha, another smaller urban area, Kearney, but then a great deal of the state is rural. So kind of thinking through all of those different parameters as we thought about what he needed to accomplish, what his strategy would be, and what would be the best way to take his brand and share it with the state.
Great, great. And Nicole, I know President Fox, coming from his position as provost at Cornell, any context for his transition or relevant background at Florida when he began?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to what Jackie was talking about. Our former president was here for 10 years, and he really got us through the worst economic downturn in history. And with minimal layoffs, no program closures or anything like that. So, but in order to do that, you have to be very efficient, very business focused, and so as we're now through that, Dr. Fox kind of brings that that warmth that we need to probably to get to the next level. So as you mentioned, he is our 12th president. He came from Cornell. He served as provost there for 6 years. This is University of Florida is his 4th land grant university. So that mission is very, very important to him. He has spent the majority of his life outside of the state of Florida, but he did graduate from high school in Miami. So he has some ties to the state, which is very helpful for us. We are, for those of you who don't know Florida geography, Gainesville is right smack dab in the center of the state. So it takes about 6 hours to get to through the Panhandle, and another 6 hours or so to get down to Miami. So we're rural. but it is the third most populous state. So it is important to have those ties in those big markets down south. Dr. Fox jokes, or not jokes, but he does talk a lot about the reaction from friends and colleagues when he told them that he was leaving an Ivy League school to come down to Florida. And he's very proud of this decision, and impressed with the meaningful breadth and depth here in terms of the outstanding research, the academic and athletic programs. I mean, there's just championship programs all over. And what makes Dr. Fox unique is really his training and his background. He has a PhD, and his focus has been in computer science engineering, but he also holds a master's degree in divinity. And so that has been a really nice balance between the analytical side of things and the more personal side of things. So we're very lucky, and I'll talk about the way that has manifested itself and how he's demonstrating that.
Okay, and fascinating situations for both of you, and I want to get into the work that you've done and continue to do. And where do you even begin with the myriad of considerations that must be taken into account? And Nicole, if you could begin and talk a little bit about how did you even begin to put together a plan? What were some of those initial thoughts? And give us some insight on the thinking that took place among you and your team.
Sure. So the University of Florida is the flagship university in Florida, and we have always benefited from high level of awareness and very competitive admissions criteria, great classes that we're able to admit for undergrad and graduate. We benefit from great state support. And so Dr. Fox arrived, though, and raised the bar and set a new benchmark, and that is, it's not about Florida, it's about national and international stature. And he talks about stature, not rankings, because we can impact stature significantly more than we can impact rankings. So some of the things that we did here in communications was, first and foremost, we reorganized our communications office. We have been organized, or had been organized in a much more siloed way. So we had our news function, we had our social media, marketing, but we all worked in silos. And so reorganizing under one umbrella was the very first thing we did. We spent a lot of time working with him and within our own group, identifying the key audiences and stakeholders. Who do we need to talk to and when? We do have a branding campaign, the Gator Good. So we aligned our Gator Good branding campaign and our news and public relations efforts to have a national focus as opposed to the state focus. Social media. We have a whole plan for social media involving the president. And then we've also been working very closely with advancement. We're getting ready to kick off a $3 billion capital campaign next year. And so working with them has been very important for us too.
And Jackie, at the University of Nebraska, if you could walk us through your thought process there in terms of where you began with the planning process. And Nicole mentioned, for example, prioritizing target audiences. How did you go about that as part of your planning and preparations for the new president there?
Sure. Let me back up a little and say that our situation is slightly different than Nicole's because I work in the system office. And so the University of Nebraska is comprised of 4 different universities. We have a flagship university, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, but also the University of Nebraska Medical Center, University of Nebraska Omaha, which is a metropolitan university, and the University of Nebraska Kearney, which is a rural university. So we have 4 chancellors and then the president who is over all of them. So what we thought about was who are his different constituencies and who are his different audiences. You've got donors, you've got the legislature and policymakers, you've got the people of the state of Nebraska, you've got internal audiences across 4 very different campuses. How do we list them out and then almost prioritize them, students of course, and say he's got a certain amount of time to touch all of them initially. Let's try to concentrate touches on audiences he might need to see immediately. Let's make sure not to leave anyone out, such as the outstate audiences. So making sure we had those all down in a strategy. The other thing that we did with the president is because he was new to the state, and because Nebraska, it's about 1.8 million people, there is a rural part of it, and because we're the state's only public university, we thought it was very important for him to start at home. So unlike Nicole, we didn't want to focus on the national right away. We wanted to make sure that he really had a good handle on home base, the taxpayers and constituents of Nebraska, and the policymakers that fund us. So we really focused that first year at home.
Great. And I understand the challenge being at Indiana University, and we have an 8-campus system, and that coverage of trying to get everywhere around the state and to each campus, and especially during that time where all your actions as a new president count, and everyone is watching, everyone is wanting to see the new president. And I would imagine it's such a time of intense scrutiny, especially for you and others who are behind the scenes, really trying to coordinate and orchestrate and maximizing the opportunity. And did you feel some of that scrutiny as you tried to put this plan together?
Absolutely. You know, because we're the state's only public university, Nebraskans have a real pride in the University of Nebraska. They feel a lot of ownership. And I'm going to move on to athletics, which is obviously a subset. Our flagship campus has the Huskers, and we don't have a pro sports team in Nebraska, so everyone just loves the university for many reasons. That means that they care deeply about the university president. President Bounds told me shortly after he came, I was given the advice that there are 3 key people in Nebraska who everyone knows who they are and cares about what they do: the governor, the football coach, and the university president. And he was right. So we really felt the pressure of being successful, you know, very quickly after he arrived, and making sure that he could connect with a very wide variety of people and set him up for success in the next year.
And we know that a president should be the ultimate brand champion for an institution. And we wanted to touch on in this episode, not just the work you do in marketing a new president, but how does the president's own brand come into play, and then how do you help further develop that and shape that? And I would imagine the brand champion role for a new president might be a little bit harder when someone has not even really experienced the brand yet. So how did you go about that balance of, we want to further the institution's brand, at the same time we want to put the president's brand out in front and further develop that? So there's just a lot of complexity to managing both of those, I would imagine, but at the same time a great opportunity. So could you speak to that a little bit at Florida, Nicole, and how you thought about both of those items?
Sure. So Dr. Fox he set the tone for us, and he has made it very clear that our efforts are to be about the University of Florida and not about him. Now, he recognizes that he is a major piece of the university, but he really likes to focus on the efforts of the faculty, the programs here, the research, etc., and less about him. He can be the spokesperson, but he wants to share what's happening on behalf of the university. The tone really is very stately. He wants it to be sophisticated, but at the same time, there's an element of joy. He always talks about the joy concept, and that was one of the things that drew him to Florida, was this idea of, I guess you and I would probably call it work hard, play hard. There's a passion here and an excitement, and just like our Saturday football games, you know, there's such tremendous energy, and people are truly have a spirit of joy here on this campus that you can feel, and he wants to make sure that people see that more than anything and feel that.
And Jackie, at Nebraska, going back to the role of a president, one of the many things in being the ultimate brand champion for the institution, and how did you go about preparing him to serve in that role?
Well, President Bounds came at a very interesting time, because we had just started developing a brand strategy for the University of Nebraska, and we really hadn't looked at that in almost 10 years. So when I came on board about almost 3 years ago, that was a project that I took on. So he came right at the time when we were doing a discovery process. We worked with 160 over 90, and Nicole, I believe that your university.
Uh-huh.
We have a commonality. So they came on board, and they were able to start the discovery process shortly after the president started. So he was able to be a key part of that. So I think the university's brand strategy evolving at the same time as a new president being there was very, very helpful. Similar to what Nicole says, obviously a president reflects the institution, and so Dr. Bounds did want it to be about the university. But given the prominence of a university president in Nebraska as not really a political figure, but as a public figure, we wanted to think about his role very, very carefully and how to introduce him to the state. And so we really tried to talk about his personality and some of the things he stood for strategically, what was he like, and we fit that together, if that makes sense, with the brand strategy so that they were complementary to each other. They're kind of part and parcel of each other, with the president being, in a way, the physical manifestation of being the spokesperson and the key brand champion for the university. So we really talked a lot of the tone and feel being very confident, very forward-thinking, very approachable and collaborative. And those are all traits that are very Nebraska-like. People are communal here. They help each other out. They're hardworking. They probably don't talk about the good things they do enough, so we wanted to make sure that we amped that up. And they're approachable, and he fit right in. He's just a down-to-earth person, obviously highly intelligent, bright, and articulate, but people feel like, he's the people's president. People felt like they can come up and talk to him, whether they're at a gas station or a high formal event. So I think that her personality fit very well with the state of Nebraska and the brand personality of the University of Nebraska. And then there was a visionary side to his personality and a very forward-thinking side that also fit with where we wanted to go strategically and academically.
And how about the first few days or even that first week? And I'm sure lots of planning and preparations, but it probably got even crazier than you expected once he finally got in office. So what was it like in the trenches? What were you trying to accomplish in those first few days and first few weeks when he came to the university?
It was actually a little crazy before he even got there. So this will tell you about the state of Nebraska. Our two major dailies, the Omaha World Herald and the Lincoln Journal-Star, both have dedicated higher ed reporters, which is somewhat rare in this day and age. The Omaha World Herald sent a reporter out to Mississippi to follow him around for a week before he came. So there was a very lengthy feature article about him with photos to introduce him to the state before he even got here. So we had a lot of conversations about the strategy before he came, and he came the day of our spring game, which is our scrimmage. 86,000 people paying to attend a football practice. He was able to be there at the spring game to kind of kick off his start here. And then he went on a 1-week road tour throughout the entire state of Nebraska. He drove end to end. He met with people. He talked at Rotaries. He visited all of our campuses. And he really made an effort to say, I'm here to listen and learn. I'm here to meet Nebraskans. And that was crazy, just putting that together, making sure we had everything lined up, and making sure he had an effective schedule, also putting together speaking points for him. We had to meet with him before he came and say, we know that you're finding out about Nebraska, and part of this is going to be a discovery process, but what's some of the vision you have in mind? Why did you come here, and what would you like to see happen? One of the things he told us is, he was managing a university system, all of the universities in Mississippi, that had, altogether, they had more students, probably a bigger budget, but they're universities that weren't part of the same system. They were kind of a league of university. And so they competed with each other a lot. Our university is a university system where at the end of the day, we're all part of one family. And he really loved the breadth and depth in Nebraska, the fact that we had urban campuses, we had rural campuses. It was really the perfect lab to do research in and to solve some of the world's grand problems because of the depth of the state and the many, many kinds of areas that we encompassed. So we talked about all that, and his vision was that the University of Nebraska could be a giant in higher education. So we started his road tour really with that theme, and throughout the rest of the year filled out, well, what does that mean? So he was able to have a theme, a vision, forward-looking statement, and then we were able to put more meat on the bones as we went along.
Great. And Nicole, how about at the University of Florida? What was the work like that you were doing in the days leading up to President Fox beginning, and give us a behind the scenes look at what that first week or few weeks or first few days looked like for you and your staff?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So we had what I would think is a unique situation where we had a sitting president. We didn't have an interim. So Dr. Matchen's last day was December 31st, and Dr. Fox's first day was January 1st. So we wanted to be very careful to respect Dr. Matchen's position until the end. So a lot of our planning was happening behind the scenes, and so when he came on board, you know, that's when we started our meetings with him. He did meet also. The Gainesville Sun, our local paper, went up to Cornell and followed him around also to see who he is and talk a little bit about that. And then, so when he did come down, his key priority was meeting with the deans, the faculty, and students. He went into classrooms. He stood in line at Starbucks and talked to students. People didn't know who he was. And so he really tried to kind of hide behind a curtain, if you will, for the first few days, just to kind of understand what was going on before we officially introduced him. And then he had the opportunity, just because of the timing of it all, almost immediately had to go into the legislative session. And so he was able to meet many of the legislators and key government officials there. But over the course of those first couple weeks, we did start putting together the plan. We have locations and in all 67 counties here in Florida. And so he committed to visiting all of those over the first 18 months or so. And then we also started planning inauguration, you know, the formal activities, and but we actually ended up planning that for 11 months after his arrival. So very similar, just identifying who those key people are and just getting them out on the road.
So a quick reminder, if anyone listening has a question or a comment for Nicole or Jackie, feel free to tweet using the Higher Ed Live hashtag. And I think it's interesting, as I mentioned in the opening, how both of you began in 2014, new presidents in 2015. So the fact that you were both relatively new at your institutions, and was that an advantage in any way that you were new and you could look at this transition through a similar lens? Just curious on that, and either of you feel free to chime in.
I thought it, oh, go ahead.
You go ahead, Nicole.
I thought it was fantastic. It was a great way to get introduced to everyone all at once, and we've got a great team here, and so it was fantastic as far as that trial by fire for me almost too.
And for me, Rob, you know, I went through 3 presidents in my first 3 years. So I overlapped with the president that was leaving, President Milliken, for about 4 months, then an interim president, then during the search, and then obviously with Dr. Bounds starting. So I feel like being new and kind of seeing that transition through 3 leaders really gave me a catbird seat and some insights as to, you know, what works, what doesn't work. People don't handle change the best. It's very difficult for everybody, you know, the university staff. But so just seeing all of those things going on internally, externally, I think was very positive for me. The other thing that was great was I was the new person when I started, but because we had a new president, by the time he came, I wasn't new anymore. The focus was on him. And so I was able to learn as much as possible the year prior to him coming, and then really turn the focus on what can I do to help him. And honestly, I'm viewing the university with relatively new eyes as well. What are some of the things I didn't know that he might need to know? So I feel like it was advantageous for me to be there for only a year before he came.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, Jackie, about people's reactions to change, and sometimes I think of leadership in a sense of being all about creating that positive change. And that's often what a new leader is charged with doing. But at the same time, a new president coming in, especially someone that may be seen initially as an outsider, you need to do that listening tour, and you need to hear from all stakeholders. And so I think there's a delicate balance there. And I think from a fundraising perspective, and Nicole, you mentioned being in the middle of a campaign. Gerald Panis has a book called The First 120 Days about presidential transitions. And in it, he talks about how you should really take advantage of that honeymoon period, that it's the best possible time to ask for money, because major donors are more willing than ever at that time to provide whatever the new president needs. So I'm thinking from your perspectives as being a fellow colleague and leader at the university, how, just from a leadership perspective, how you thought about that. Okay, on one hand, we need to make sure that there's this listening piece, but at the same time, there's this window of opportunity as a new president, the honeymoon period, if you will, where people may be especially receptive to what the new president wants to get done. Is that something that you had to navigate at Nebraska in any way, Jackie?
That was something that we sat down and talked about. There are other leadership books out there that talk about, obviously the first year is critical for any high-level leader, the first 90 days particularly so. So we talked about, what do you want to accomplish in the first 3 months, the first 6 months, and the first year. And he really wanted to make listening a big part of what he did the first 3 months, because, especially being an outsider, because you don't know what you don't know. We were in the middle of a budget session, but that was pretty much over by the time he came in. And so there was a little bit of a space for him to spend some time learning without needing to make any major decisions, if that makes sense. So we really focused on getting him in front of those key donors, getting him in front of policymakers, some of the key leaders that he needed to get to know, and making sure that he had several touches with them the first 3 months. After that, he was able to flesh his strategy out a little bit more, get some quick wins. Here's my plan, for example, for how I want to move forward on our 4 university-wide institutes, which were established in some areas that we have strengths in, to get us national prominence. So it gave him some time to listen and learn, put together a thoughtful strategy, roll out some tactics. So it really was a rolling plan, if that makes sense. And even affected his installments. So at Nebraska, that's typically happened within the first 3 to 6 months that a new leader starts. He delayed his for a year, and that was intentional so that he could listen, learn, roll out some wins, and then use it to launch his second year of leadership on a platform. He could talk about what his long-term vision looked like.
And Nicole, at Florida, did you have to navigate that as well, or were you involved in helping to shape that balance between listening and doing for a new president in those first months and during the first year?
Yeah, we actually took a whole year also. He wanted to, and he said in all of his presidential listening tours, we call them PLTs, that he was only listening. He didn't want to talk about the vision or goals or anything at that point until he had heard from everyone. And so with the PLTs, we took it across the state, the major markets, and that's where he met with donors, and we scheduled the editorial board meetings. We had alumni events, etc. And they were big to-dos. People were very excited. He's so welcoming and warm, and just a great person, and these events showed that personality. And so the first, it was more than 90 days or 120 days. It was definitely that first year. And now we're starting to roll out the goals and all of the strategic initiatives that are underway, because he's in year 2 now.
And Nicole, in that first year, did you have a specific vision for what success would look like, or even specific metrics that you were applying to the things that you wanted to accomplish from a communications and marketing standpoint during that first year?
We didn't have specific metrics, but we did have there was one criteria, I guess, if you want to talk about, and that is it had to be authentic. We had to capture his voice and his vision, and so through social media, and we have an opportunity like we've never had before to make the president accessible to everyone. And so we wanted to be able to do that, but we didn't want to create his personality, that was not authentic. And so he has very much taken up in the social media on social media channels, and that's how we're evaluating and tracking now. And he's very competitive as far as his followers and all of that, but we didn't initially have any specific metrics.
And Jackie, how about you in terms of defining success from a marketing and communication standpoint for that first year, and perhaps even measuring success?
Sure. A lot of the time, or a lot of the success metrics were simply setting up the channels for him to succeed on an ongoing basis, right? So getting his social media live, getting his website live, auditing what's out there and making sure that we had all the pieces in place. So, an editorial plan, what we wanted to do with the media, what we wanted to do with digital. One of the things I'll tell you about metrics is, so I had the goal that I shared with him to try, and I don't know if it was a pie in the sky goal, but to try to touch everyone in Nebraska 7 times. So obviously I'm not going to know if I touched every single person, but 1.8 million people in Nebraska, wanted to touch them 7 times because that's the average repetitive time that it takes for a message to sink in. So I needed to average that, but that was a very high level goal. I'd say most of the first year was establishing a baseline to see what kind of coverage did we get? What kind of impressions did he get? And then we were able to set some goals for this year. So we tracked, for example, on Twitter, we set up his account. We kind of monitored it for a couple of months. But what I did is I pulled a couple of other university presidents, the former university presidents, some like Mitch Daniels and Santo Ono that were very known on Twitter, and then others from universities that were similar to our size. And I put down the number of followers that they had, but I averaged it over the number of months they had been on Twitter. Does that make sense? So it gave a more straight line. Again, I had to average everything. About how many followers did they get a month during the time they'd been alive? And so then my goal was to try to top that, if that makes sense. What could we put in place when you put him among some peers to make sure that he was getting a pretty high and consistent number of followers? Obviously, I couldn't track their engagement, and that was also another piece, is to make sure he had high engagement, but trying to put some benchmarks in place against other universities, and then tracking things like, halfway through the year, we wanted to see what kind of media coverage he was getting. Obviously, that was part of the honeymoon period. The media were very interested in hearing from him and covering him. Lots of op-eds picked up, lots of editorials, lots of coverage, but that hasn't seemed to slow down. So really what we did was to track everything that we did and then set some goals for increasing that coverage the second year, which is tougher because people are more familiar with him. Is he as new and shiny as he was before? And we've kept on track pretty well with what we did the first year.
Great. And I'm sure that listeners would also value hearing any specific examples of successes, whether that's something that happened anecdotally, or maybe it's an event, or a specific initiative on social or elsewhere. So I'm just curious in terms of any of the strategies or tactics that may have worked especially well over the course of the first year for Dr. Bounds at Nebraska.
Absolutely. I would say that because he can't be everywhere in person, that digital sub-strategy was critical. So we set up a really robust website. It's about 12 pages that has anything related to him. We wanted it to be, the number one place that people went for information for him. We also Googled him and made sure that when you Googled him, we owned the narrative. So we created a Wikipedia page. We fleshed out LinkedIn, not because he was going to use it a lot, but because we needed to control the story, and we wanted to make sure that our story was what came up when you searched him. So Twitter, LinkedIn, Wikipedia. Twitter was really critical in creating a conversation, so he was able to listen and learn, but also to engage and speak. That was very, very successful for him. I read the book Follow the Leader, which M. Stoner was also involved in, and we sat down and put together some guidelines for what he wanted to talk about, things he wanted to stay away from, how engaged he wanted to be. And he's very aware of what's happening on Twitter, and has really used it to his advantage. We also worked with our ad agency to extend his in-person, his physical listening tour to a digital listening tour. So we had him ask questions or answer questions anyone from the state or from the university asked, and we would answer them, and we did that for a 3-week period. He had an incredible lift in engagement, in followers. I mean, he increased followers over 100%. I think he went from 1,000 to over 2,000 followers during that time period. But even more than that, we were just inundated with questions and statements and really rich conversations. We had people from outside of the state starting to chime in. We had tech leaders really talking about how they saw him in a very different way. There aren't a lot of university presidents that are using social actively. There's some risks that are associated, and you have to be committed to that, to using it. And so we had a really rich conversation that just wore the team out because we were monitoring it constantly for 3 weeks. And we really put a lot of promotion around, if that makes sense. We put a news release about it. We had a web page, and we also put a contest around it, or basically what we said is we want you to continue the conversation in person. So we selected the 2 individuals who had the most robust conversations with him, and we invited them to his suite for a major game where they could continue that conversation in person. So it was just an incredible 3 weeks to see the type of engagement, to select that winner, to have them come to the pregame and to the suite. You know, they tweeted about it. So everyone, it really started off his leadership and his leadership in social media on a super positive note, and just has continued to go from there. In fact, he wrote an article, an editorial that was published in Higher Ed in the past 2 months about higher ed leaders using social media, particularly new presidents, to listen and learn and to help develop their agenda. So that was an incredible experience for us, and we were very glad that we approached it in that strategic and intentional way.
That's great. Congrats to you and your team. So, Jackie, how do you keep the momentum going after the first year?
Well, that's a tough question. You know, like you said, there's honeymoon, there's Twitter. I think there's always something that's going to happen on a university campus, whether that's around diversity, you know, all sorts of issues that can happen, athletics, etc. He has presented himself as accessible and transparent. And so what we are working on is how do we continue to keep him accessible as more and more people want to talk to him, more and more people want his time. How do we continue to give him that personal touch point that people are craving? So I think it's not necessarily creating the volume, it's just keeping up with it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I would, I was just going to add to that, you know, as we're having, you know, a little bit of unrest as a nation, it's also difficult and challenging to balance these very highly accessible presidents and trying to figure out at what point, when should they be accessible and not, because otherwise, you know, he could potentially be sharing information every single day and lending sympathy, support, and so we're trying to balance that too.
Sure. And Nicole, looking back at 2015 and into 2016, and the multitude of things that you and your office did in support of the new president, was there anything that stood out, or any particular strategies or tactics that worked particularly well for you?
Yeah, you know, we did a lot of what Jackie had talked about the president's website and some of these other activities. We really rolled out his social channels gradually. So starting with Facebook and Twitter, then, you know, he's got an Instagram and a Snapchat now, and he's doing Facebook Live. So the response there has just been so very positive. And actually, he just launched Facebook, or did his first Facebook Live last week, and had over 12,000 views on that one. And we figure he's reached about 250,000 people through that. So we were pleased with that. He still hasn't forgotten, though, some of the more traditional things. So he's made it a point to go and schedule monthly editorial board meetings with our student newspaper. and he writes a regular op-ed for that also. And then going back to the social media side of things, he's very funny. He's got some great ideas, and so he did an April Fool's video right before. I guess he's been there 4 months, and we had a new coach, a new football coach, and the new president, and all starting within the same time period. And so for April Fool's, this first year, he and Coach Mack switched places. So Coach Mack became the president, he became the football coach, and so that was a whole thing that we played out all for that whole day. Anyway, and so it's just been, he's this year for April Fool's, he and President Thrasher from FSU switched. We talked about merging the two universities, which, if you know FSU and UF, they are mortal enemies. But anyway, so just showing his personality, and that's really been what we've been trying to do.
Well, as I think about colleagues who may be embarking on an experience that both of you just went through, perhaps going through a search or nearing the conclusion of a search, and that person wants to be proactive as they think about their forthcoming leadership transition, what advice would you give to a fellow marketer? I'm sure there are things that you probably can't even think of until you actually go through it, but what are one or two things that you might share as some tips or pieces of advice for someone who's going to be going through what you went through?
I'm happy to jump in here, Rob. So every situation is probably going to be slightly different. So they may want, leaders may want to modify based on their personality and their institution. But a few things that we found useful was when we created a piece of content about the president, how could we leverage that as many places as possible? Does that make sense? So for example, he does halftime interviews at all of the football games. And that's a great way to get longer form content out about some of the key initiatives about the university, with him leading the conversation. But we got MP3s of those. We put them on his website. We share them on social media. We made social shares with some of his talking points. So how do you use each piece of the pie and replicate it or leverage it as much as possible? Another thing that we did, and it's just a small thing I think that helped, is that we created a look and feel for him that tied all of his communication together, whether it's emails or his business card, his website. So every time you saw something, you knew that it was coming from the president, and it complemented the University of Nebraska brand, but it was, the University of Nebraska brand is a lot more progressive and forward-thinking, and it's going to appeal to a younger audience. This was a little bit more presidential and stately. So obviously in his talking points, in his strategy, there's a thread. How do you extend that to make sure that design and how things look and feel add to that collective understanding that this is the president of the university? So those are a few of the things I may think of more as Nicole talks as well, and I can pop back in.
So from our perspective, we also, we really spent a lot of time to foster positive town and gown relationships. Gainesville is a college town, and so there's historically been a little bit of push and give and take, probably the feeling of more giving or taking than giving on behalf of the university. So we really wanted to make sure that we positioned him and made sure that he meets with local leaders to foster that. The other thing is, I would say that he has a speechwriter, and that speechwriter is not in our office, and that's a relationship that we've really fostered also to make sure that his speeches and the key message points were all on the same page as far as that goes, which has not always been the case here, so which was always surprising to me. So now it is. We've got a great relationship with this speechwriter, and so I would highly recommend that continues. And then I think the most important thing, though, is just making sure that the communications reflect the tone and the personality of the president and the university. And that's key. You can't fake that.
Yeah, this has been really fun. I've thought back many times during our conversation to the last time that I went through this at one of our campuses at Indiana University with a new chancellor back in 2013. And as I reflect on that, I think of what a demanding time it was, but at the same time, it was very exhilarating and was also a time of professional growth too, because of all the new experiences that came with that. So I'll, in closing, pose the same question to both of you in terms of reflecting on what you have gone through and any lessons there that you've learned or picked up that you think will help you professionally as you move forward in your day-to-day marketing and communications work.
For me, this is Nicole. It's a matter of, I kind of mentioned it before, but as we're going through the unrest as a nation, I think it's more important than ever that we have leaders who are accessible and communicative, and you have to build that relationship with all constituents, and that is vital for his success. And so I think these first few days and first year or so has been vital to that, and we're very lucky on this campus to be able to have a leader who is interested in talking to everyone and is great at it. So he makes our jobs easier.
Excellent. And Jackie, any lessons from the work that you've done that you'll be able to carry forward with you?
Well, very much agreed with Nicole is the person can make it very easy for you. I mean, Dr. Bound's personality, his gifts, his skill set, and his approach just made it easy. If you're looking from a private sector perspective, I mean, the product matters, right? So the University of Nebraska and the affection that people have for it, the high quality research and faculty we have, and just the quality of the president and his understanding of how important communication is both to the university and to him as a leader, really helped it to be very successful. Personally, so I came to the university 2.5 years ago, but I came from the private sector, and so I had not worked directly in higher ed before. I had not worked in supporting an individual, a public figure, a person, and so this has been a very exciting and interesting experience for me to really think about how to find what's true, what's best about them, what aligns with the institution they're serving, and kind of a Venn diagram, and then what people want to know, how to fit those things together strategically and how to facilitate them has just been a tremendous experience.
Well, terrific. Jackie and Nicole, really enjoyed this. It's been fantastic, and appreciate your sharing the experiences that you had, and big congratulations to the work that you've done, and wish you both continued success.
Thank you, Rob.
Well, as always, thank you as well to M. Stoner for making Marketing Live possible, and be sure to get reminders about this and other episodes by subscribing to the Higher Ed Live newsletter. You can browse the archives at higheredlive.com or subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. I'm Rob Zinkin. Thanks again for tuning in to Marketing Live on the Higher Ed Live Network.